I am here with Rafa, who's currently a researcher at the Summer of Protocols and is the founder of Folklore, a community of curation, also a good friend. Rafa, I'm so excited to have you on the pod.
I'm excited to be here. It's been, how long has it been since we first met? I think has it been 2 years already?
I
I
think
think it
it's,
might be a couple
yeah,
of years.
I think it's probably a couple of years, which is wild.
Yeah, you met me before a lot of things had happened, uh,
Yes,
which is quite exciting.
it's been an eventful 2 years.
Yeah.
I cannot wait to talk about a few spicy takes today. I think you've thought really deeply about media and on-chain media, and also protocols and how all of those things interact with one another. But before we do that, maybe you can give a little bit of background on you and how you fell on the crypto rabbit hole and what you've been doing for the last couple of years.
Absolutely. I tell this story often. The beginning or the origin story is always goes back to a summer that I had at my uncle's hardware store. He had this company where he used to sell doors and other type of like housing items. And my parents had gotten me a job there for the summer, and it was in college. And the job was to count screws all summer. And I had to sit down in the basement. I had this little stool and had like a bunch of screws, and I needed to put those screws into baggies of like 100. And about a month in, I honestly can't believe it took me a month. I asked myself, like, why am I not weighing these? Like, why am I still counting these by hand? And it's kind of, I laugh in retrospect, but I feel like this is a lot of how the world works. Like, you do a thing for a very long time, then you ask yourself, like, you kind of wake up and you ask, why? Why am I doing this? And so I go to my uncle and I ask him, hey, can I use a weight? And he's like, no, we're paying you to count screws. And I felt like that was such a good metaphor for all the work that we do, that everybody does across any specific company. And so I sat back and I was like, man, like this is so inefficient. I should just use a weight. Like, I don't know, buy screws in packets of 100. This doesn't make any sense. And that kind of led me down a rabbit hole of how organizations coordinate and how humans get together and provide value. Fast forward to 2019, I had already spent a couple of years reading about crypto and always thinking every year that I was late. Since like 2015, I was like, it's too late. 2016, it's too late to get into this. I remember thinking about getting a job at Coinbase and saying, this company is already done. And so finally in 2019, when I was looking at alternative models for coordination, because I was working in human resources, I was like very dissatisfied with kind of how employee relations and the reward and incentive structures worked. I came across online communities, which I had already been a part of, but again, took many years to wake up and say, wait, there might be something here. And so that online communities happened to coincide with a lot of conversation about DAOs, and how Ethereum was producing new tools for on-chain treasury management and coordination. And yeah, the rest is history. 4 years later, still here.
Yeah, so you spent I was going to say a couple years. That is not true. Like a year maybe at Mirror, and then also started Folklore, which I'm very excited to talk about. Maybe you can give a little bit of context on the thought behind Folklore and what it is.
Absolutely. So as part of my insatiable curiosity for how humans coordinate, I'd spend the better part of the last decade reading articles and saving some hyperlinks. I think this started back in 2016 or so. So I'd save these like links that didn't go anywhere. I just like save them, and as you would do, you would put them in a file and then never read them. Some of them I read, and in August of last year, I had gone out the night before, and usually the next morning, after my brain is a bit more quiet, some interesting ideas, not all good ones, most of them bad, but some interesting ideas happen. And I woke up and I said, this doesn't make any sense. I'm the one like saving all these links. People are asking me for these links. I should just, I don't know, start a paid Telegram group. And I was working at Mirror at the time, and I was like, oh, this will be great because it will help me also test out the functionality of Mirror. We had just launched like writing NFTs that summer. And I was like, I'm just going to test out how this functionality works and see what we can build. And so that morning, I woke up at like 8:30 or 9 a.m., a bit cloudy, and I wrote the article that started Folklore. I was like, hey, I'm going to start this Telegram group for people who are interested in the type of stuff that I read. Just feel free to buy the writing NFT, and this will be season 1. Like, let's do it, ship it, as you would say. And so I started the token group. I ended up selling out all 150 memberships. I wanted to keep it capped. And that's how Folklore began, which is simply a drip. It was this idea that I wanted to get an article a day, which is the membership that I wanted to pay for, but the service didn't really exist for the topics that I was interested in, or for the intersection of reading that I was interested in. As a result of that, Folklore over the last, it's been 9 months now, has consistently had a curated article every 1 to 2 days. And then the membership, the payments for membership are reinvested into essays commissioned by Folklore. Bear in mind, we have not published a single commissioned essay yet, but we do expect the first one to come out at the end of the month, which we're very excited about.
Yeah, I loved watching Folklore evolve. And it is an incredibly active Telegram chat, which is so cool to see. But also in the context of creating media, and also in your time at Mirror, and I think your research across the space more broadly, you are, I think, one of the deepest thinkers on what on-chain media actually looks like and what it can look like, and what some of the challenges are right now. So can you talk through a little bit of how you're thinking about on-chain media and where media lives, and what ownership looks like in the context of Folklore creating content and essays and things?
Yeah. So one of the things that the main reason why I had joined Mirror initially was because I really believe in their mission of being able to put context on digital assets and making that context a digital asset as well. When you have practical experience like building these NFTs, something quite magical kind of happens, which is you start realizing the power of this portability and composability. You realize the fact that this tokenization process provides a sort of physicality to a JPEG, which it doesn't actually exist. I like to think about blockchain as almost like a protocol of time, where it embeds a timestamp, an actual time, into the digital assets, which means downstream from that, you can actually trade, you can know who has the object. It provides a materiality, a weight, a mass to assets which don't exist in meat space or in real life. And so there's lots of downstream consequences, which I don't really even know what they are, but intuitively, by creating NFTs and interacting with them, using them as memberships, using them as ways to save information, as archiving, you start to get this sensory reaction that you're actually dealing with something which is not just a PDF or a Google document, not just a file. And that's really exciting, and I'm kind of very interested to see where we go. It's not every day that we have ownership in a digitized form. It's quite new.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I know some of your research is centered around, if you use the analogy of like the blockchain almost creates a physicality, how you instantiate that physical object is actually a very interesting question, because there are tons of protocols around the creation of this type of on-chain, like crypto media, as you call it. And so I'm curious how you think about the decision of how to actually bring that thing to life on chain?
I think the first, so let's take Folklore for an example. In the morning that I was writing this article, the decision was very easy. I was like, oh, I'm just going to make this writing NFT on Ethereum on Mirror. The reason was because I wanted to publish a post on Mirror. It was super cheap when gas was high back 9 months ago. Gas was, I don't know, on mainnet ridiculous. And gas on L2s was relatively very cheap and very low. And so I defaulted to Ethereum and to Mirror as a protocol. Now, I think this kind of points to an interesting reflection, which is you do have to choose a chain. Like, am I going to do this on Polygon? Am I going to do this on Bitcoin soon? I would imagine their functionality is expanding. On Ethereum mainnet, am I going to do it on a layer 2, Arbitrum, Optimism? So you have a chain decision that you need to make, which defines an ecosystem of products and protocols that you can participate in. And at a second level to that, then you have to make a decision on the protocol itself. So I could have, for example, created a membership on Zora or on Manifold or on ThirdWeb. That's kind of like a secondary decision. But then you have a third layer, which is you also have to make a decision to which standard you're actually going to execute on. So each chain will likely have different standards. So you have an ERC 721, ERC 1155, and ERC 20. Like, I could have done a membership that was just an ERC 20 on, on Polygon, for example. And it's kind of interesting because even then you need another layer of technical knowledge. What does that standard even include? What makes it special? I had chosen an ERC 1155 because I was thinking about creating a collection of memberships over the long term, and because that was what Mirror defaulted to. And it's kind of interesting now looking back, like, would I do that again? I'm not 100% sure. I'm thinking about season 2 and I'm thinking I probably want an ERC 721 because I want like an index number, and I don't know if I want it to be a separate collection. I'm probably going to end up using Optimism as an L2. I like their vibe, and vibes are important when choosing a protocol. I mean, after all, you're kind of committing your community to the philosophy of the protocols that you're actually working with. And not just that, you're committing your community to whatever fee structure that they have in place and whatever fee structure that they'll have in the future. So in a way, your community becomes liquidity, or I would call it like content liquidity for a media protocol. And in the same way that in DeFi, an LP needs to decide where they're going to deploy their capital for the best return, creators are having to choose standards and protocols to where they're going to invest their community attention and infrastructure so that the community has the best possible foundation for their growth.
Yeah, I think this idea of content as liquidity is a really, really important one when we think about the context of what on-chain media looks like, what it means to have protocols where all of the content is sort of aggregating. And one thing that I want to talk about in this context that I know you've thought deeply about is this idea that, like, in theory, I think we often don't think about content liquidity because technically standards like ERC 1155 and 721, and for people who aren't familiar, like, those are both NFT standards. They're just a little bit different. But in theory, those are like interoperable and you can switch between protocols and it doesn't really matter. But in practice, that is not always true. Can you dive a little bit into why? Because I think often, like, in the context in my head, something like LPing, right? Providing liquidity on Uniswap. That's very clear because it's Uniswap as a protocol. And technically the tokens that you're providing liquidity with are interoperable, but like you're locking your tokens into the protocol. And so it becomes obvious. I think with NFTs, it's a little weirder because it's like technically I could mint on one platform and sell on OpenSea. And in a lot of cases that is true. But yeah, where does interoperability play into this idea of content liquidity on protocols?
Yeah. Okay, so let's take a step back. We have on-chain media, which we can think about content deployed. It can be on IPFS, it can be on Arweave, it can be on LivePeer, it can be on Zora, right, or Manifold. This is like content which is on-chain. As a subset of that, you have tokenized media, which is content which is tied to a specific token ID and contract. So this is, for example, an NFT project. The media, the on-chain media, may be hosted on IPFS, or it might be rendered in the same contract that you have. And that contract actually has tokens, so they have like IDs attached to them. So they're actually like things like foods that you have sitting on the table. Now, in that tokenized media, that tokenized media can be a custom contract. So I can deploy a contract to Ethereum and say, this is Raf's contract. And I can use an ERC 721 standard, which means my wallet, Rainbow, or MetaMask can quote unquote read and know how to interact with that specific contract. So you have different types of like signatures and stuff like that. It doesn't need to be a custom contract. So right now we have protocols which provide different types of utilities. So gas optimization. So I don't need to create a custom contract and pay a bunch of gas to like deploy this contract. I can use like a factory on chain that optimizes so that when I do an ERC 721, I use low gas, but more importantly, it's audited, right? I know that their contract is airtight, doesn't have errors, and so on and so forth. Or at least we trust that they do, right? They're not hackable. That factory is coupled to the protocol that they have. So whatever protocol you use, you create a factory, you create your contract. Your contract now is inheriting all the wonderful opportunity and features that the protocol is offering to you. A lot of that is just a standard. So, you have like a supply of tokens and you have a current owner, and there's a function to transfer the ownership from one, address to another one. What's interesting is that token standard, so ERC 721, is very limited on purpose. So the standard is as small as possible to enable interoperability between any interface that wants to connect with an ERC 721 or 1155, whatever these types of tokens are. And within that limited standard, it gives flexibility to the service providers to create additional types of contracts. One common function that exists is the mint function. Something that I thought was true, but I didn't know, now I know, is that the mint function is actually not within the standard. So there is no standard mint function. What that means is that the protocol that you choose gives you the specific mint function that they have designed. Could be gas optimized, could enable airdropping, could have burn mechanics, like that might be a separate function. You might have a series of different functions that enhance the interaction with the specific NFT or token that you're actually creating. This is great. This is fantastic for creators because it allows you to experiment. It allows you to expand your functionality. But it's kind of interesting because one thing that we should not assume is that all the interfaces need to build out their own interoperability with the custom functions from the mint. So if you have an ERC 721 can't become an ERC 1155, right? They're different contract types, they're different factories. In the same way, a contract that you deployed on Zora can't become a contract that's hosted on Manifold or Third Web. Or a contract that you deploy on Mirror can't become a contract with Zora. And if you have an interface that integrated the mint function from, let's say, Zora, that doesn't mean that mint function actually works with a contract from Mirror or a contract from Third Web. And taking it one step further, this is why Mint.Fun is such an insane project, because they're creating interoperability with the Mint button for every single type of protocol that exists and every single type of project that exists. That is not that, that is respect the game. That's hard. Now, corollary to that, as I continue on this like protocol rant instead of platform rant, I guess, is that your distribution as a creator is predetermined by the interfaces that support your protocol choice. So if you choose to create a custom contract and create a custom mint function, the distribution of your NFT, not necessarily the viewability of it, but how many people click the mint button, is going to be restricted to the interfaces that support that mint function. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think this is the core piece that makes the content as liquidity and creators as liquidity providers all make sense. Because just to summarize, there are standards that are common denominators. For example, ERC 721, the very like basic and first core NFT standard, does define certain things. And those things are showing up in interfaces across all of these different platforms, where we can define a platform as maybe like a front end and a protocol as like the back end that actually defines things on chain. The challenge is that any additional functionality is not by default interoperable. And in most cases, it actually is not, which means that platforms are actually surfacing different functionality. And while that seems like, oh, well, at least the NFT is there, which is fair, it's also things like minting and burning of NFTs, which are core functions that are not interoperable across platforms because there is no standard for these things, unless you have something like Mint.Fun, where they come up with a standard for the specific function.
Exactly. And something that's even, let's take it one step further, even the metadata, like hosted on IPFS, right? The metadata that shows where the media is, if it's not like on, or even like if it's a read from on-chain contract, that is also not standardized. The metadata standard is optional, even in the ERC 721 definition. So, I say all of this because you go back and say, okay, as a creator, what am I going to do for season 2? And I do, which is weird. Creators, I don't know why creators need to like be this technically oriented. We need some middleware essentially to deal with this, but I have to make a decision now in terms of what protocols I want to use. And that decision like drives power to me because it's a distribution engine. So the protocol partnerships to interfaces are a distribution engine for me individually as a creator for Folklore. And my content provides power to the protocol because the protocol says, hey, look at this. All the popular creators, which have hungry, insatiable audiences, their content is hosted on my protocol. So you need to make sure that your engineering team builds out the interoperability for the additional functions that my protocol provides. And there's a dual conversation here, the dual benefit I'm getting from the protocol's distribution. I'm giving power to the protocol to be able to ask for more partnerships and increase their distribution scope. And that's super cool. That's like a type of symbiotic relationship, at least for now, because then we can think about what comes next. Well, my content is actually locked within that protocol. So I'm getting a symbiotic relationship kind of, but once I deploy my content to that protocol, if that protocol, I don't know, has any issues, gets hacked, I can't just move my content to another protocol. I have to recreate it from scratch. I have to redeploy a new contract with a new protocol. So if that protocol dies, I don't know, gets sued, goes bankrupt, I don't know, they rug their users for whatever reason, then the rebuilding of that distribution process is not as simple as, just upload your picture from Instagram to Twitter, right? Like you have to build a following again. In the same way, if you recreate your content from Zora to Manifold, you might have to do an airdrop to your current users. Like all this is expensive. Like there's an investment process. And one of the reasons why, mad respect for the DeGods team who transitioned from like I believe Solana to Polygon. Mad respect, because that transition process from one chain to another, very hard. And for in the future, creators will at some point have to be recreating content from one protocol to another. That migration will be as hard as, hopefully not as hard. Hopefully we'll have additional tools and interoperability, et cetera, but might be as hard as moving your audience from Facebook to Instagram or Instagram to Twitter, or from one social media platform to another.
Totally. Yeah. And I want to dive into this like lock-in piece and what that means for creators and also more broadly for the space. But I think just two other aspects that come to mind for me that like really demonstrate the lock-in point is, one, the thing around content liquidity. And I guess if you use Uniswap as an example, like you mentioned earlier, the entire reason that people think that Uniswap can turn on fees is because they have all of the liquidity. And similarly, that is, even if we're not thinking about hacks, but if protocols introduce really high fees where creators are like, I can't sustain this, that is a problem. And that ends up being something that like you're kind of stuck in this weird, Web 2 type paradigm. And then the second thing that comes to mind is, I just recorded an episode on ERC 6551, which is this idea that, NFTs can own other assets. And so like you could imagine a world in which I use my Folklore NFT to build out an entire identity for myself. And then we get rugged and even if I still own that asset, I then have to like think about, okay, how am I going to port over this entire identity? So I think as we build context around these NFTs, it's no longer just going to be like, oh, it's an easy copy paste into another chain or protocol.
I mean, I would take a step back. Like you still own the NFT. Like the contract is still yours, right? Like, I think what's interesting is that when if for whatever reason interfaces stop supporting a specific protocol structure, which would make sense, if we fast forward 10 to 20 years, it totally makes sense that we might have different protocols available. There might be some backwards compatibility, but your NFT may not be up to par with the latest standards. So what does that transition process look like? So protocol lock, I think we should distinguish this from. It doesn't mean that that they control your audience. No, you still control your audience. You still have like your address, like that NFT still holds your assets. You still like control the NFT and the NFT contract. But it's a question of like, where do you hit limitations in interoperability that are a consequence of your protocol choice and a consequence of your contract in a point in time? Right. I think those are important things to ask about. That locking is it's the immutability of the contract, which is the feature, is also the limitation in terms of what this space might look like in 20, 30 years. We have to ask the question, what does it look like to upgrade a contract? What does it look like to ensure that we have backwards compatibilities to standards? And if we're not doing backward compatibility to certain standards or new functions, then how are we going to address that? You also mentioned a moment ago about monetization. So protocols need some sort of monetization because we want sustainability. We want protocols to be audited. We want their functionality to increase. We want their composability and interoperability to be as rich as we possibly can. Where it gets kind of interesting is if I choose a content protocol to deploy my token assets, and I do that consistently for 10 years, so that my entire community infrastructure is built on a specific protocol. If there's only, if number one, they could raise fees and I don't have much of an option. My entire infrastructure is built on there. Migration, very problematic. It's going to feel like an enterprise, like on-prem cloud solution migration to serverless. It's like, oof, we really going to do this? Like, a lot of money. There's a lot of time. This is very technically complex to maintain the community experience in this migration. So that happens. Something more nuanced that I like is going back to this concept of content liquidity. If it's not just me, if 90% of creators or there's certain market share of creators and communities are building on a specific protocol, then that protocol has a significant amount of control, not just increasing fees for creators, but also determining which interfaces will be successful. So if a protocol says, if an interface does not, for whatever reason, maybe they have certain legal terms or whatever, I don't know, like the interface wants to make a decision to not support this protocol for whatever reason it is, then suddenly you have this question that as a creator, you don't have access to that interface, but as an interface, you don't have access to a creator base. And this is eerily similar to the discussion on royalties and the listing exclusions that has happened with NFTs on whether they can be sold on this market because you respect royalties, or this market. That's a type of protocol, like, we're not going to support this protocol. Our interface doesn't support this one. This protocol doesn't support this other protocol. And there's kind of this like emerging theme that yes, protocols do have control over who they over who they support, and interfaces have control over what protocols they choose to connect with.
Yeah, and it feels like the interplay here is like, if protocols have liquidity, they have the power over interfaces. So as an example, if 90% of creators are minting on Zora and Zora says, we're going to make the metadata available to only 3 platforms, they are giving power to those 3 platforms. And I'm using platform and interface interchangeably here, but whatever it is, it's the front end basically. So in that case, the protocol has control over what interfaces win. On the flip side, if the interfaces have distribution, then the interfaces if they have high amounts of distribution and 90% of people are using, OpenSea to discover NFTs, then the protocols that OpenSea decides to say, hey, yeah, we're going to support, Zora, that actually has that's a lot of leverage over protocols. So yeah. Does that capture the dynamic that you're calling out?
Potentially. I mean, honestly, like this is still like an emerging theme. And I think there's additional layers of research that I personally need to get clarity on. But this is like, I think the crux of it is what does happen in these like interactions. Like, I think because we have decentralized like data, so, you can't really block IPFS, like the contracts are public code. Maybe in the future where we have privacy preserving like technology, then it's possible that protocols could say, this interface is not allowed to de-encrypt our contracts, or this this interface is allowed to decrypt our contracts. Not 100% sure. So I'm not sure if the interface would, I don't know if there's a way to prevent an interface from interacting with a protocol just yet. But if an interface has their own protocol, then another, like an infrastructure protocol, let's say I make an NFT protocol called Rafa's contracts, .xyz. And an interface company, which is a block explorer, InstaChain, they have a protocol that like reads my contracts or does some sort of transformation. Hypothetically, I suspect that I could like control, Rafa's contracts could do something to prevent that. It's possible. I'm not even 100% sure. But at the very least, you can make it very difficult for them. I suspect that would be the case. And I'm curious how this will play out, like what type of power dynamics are going to exist between contract creators and contract readers. There's definitely going to be some sort of interesting power dynamic.
Yeah, which is funny because I think often when we think about things in a very simplistic manner, we're like, okay, the best protocols will win because that's where creator liquidity will exist, and the best interfaces or platforms will win because that's where the best like distribution will be. And those will exist in isolation, and we will just end up with each of the best. But that's becoming increasingly clear that they're actually quite interdependent, and there are going to be a lot of dynamics that make it so that it's not so cut and dry.
It's not so cut and dry. That was my realization, like over the past like couple weeks, which I suddenly realized, like, wait, the MIM function isn't standardized. Wait, the standard is quite limited. Wait, protocols can stack fees. Like, oh, if I'm like obviously, if I'm minting a protocol contract through an interface, and I'm probably going to get taxed twice, one at the interface level to support the interface and the user experience, and one at the protocol level for the infrastructure payment. And that makes sense. But then you start extrapolating and you say, oh, what happens when there's one monolithic protocol? What type of competition can we actually nurture to be able to drive fee prices down and not up? What does it look like to transfer content because of new functionality that emerges? Do I need to redeploy content? And that's, I think, where this entire thought process came. And again, grounding it on Folklore, like Folklore needs to make decisions as to what protocols they use for membership and who we're going to rely on for memberships. And especially, I think this problem gets increasingly more important as we think about longer term content. So when I'm thinking about lifetime memberships, for example, or the NFT is a composable and dynamic digital asset, and I start building additional complexity into this, then these questions become even more pertinent. And yes, creating a custom contract is fine. Forking another protocol is fine. So it's still like supported in some way, but it's still the question about making sure that you're following standards, making sure that your custom contract is supported by the interfaces where your community lives. Those are all important considerations that you need to keep top of mind, that I need to keep top of mind as I grow Folklore.
Yeah, it's funny because I think there's a world in which my immediate sort of like open source decentralization maxi brain is like, oh, well, of course, what will end up happening is just that if protocols are going to have, of course, there's a conversation about expansive versus extractive fees and stuff. But for the matter of this example, we'll just say that all fees are extractive, though I'm not sure that's totally true. There's a world in which you go, okay, cool. I'm just going to fork those protocols. And no worries, I'm never going to use these protocols that have fees, but that are creating a lot of value. And I think when I take the long-term view, the reality there is just that you need that level of competition. Like you almost do need an incentive for these protocols to continue innovating. And if you don't have that, I think there are a lot of questions about the longevity of this stuff, which is, I think, where that tricky dynamic comes in, because you can't just fork it and create a version of it and be done with the assumption that this stuff is going to constantly change. And you really do need teams that are constantly keeping up and innovating with the evolution of this.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the market will kind of like manage itself. Like if a protocol becomes too extractive, like someone's going to fork it, and that fork is going to be supported by the interfaces which supported the original protocol anyways. I think that's fine. I think in theory, that's right. And it's way more, composable and portable than anything that we've had today. You can't really fork Facebook and just like have an interface that works, right? That's not how it works. But when you create these dependencies, even if you did create a fork of Facebook today, even if that was possible, It doesn't mean that all the services that are interacting with Facebook and know Facebook as a trusted supplier will automatically support you. So you
Right.
have a lot of like partnership redevelopment and trust like redevelopment that you need to invest in. And that's social work that needs to get done. That's like, peer-to-peer conversations. That's, business development that needs to go through. So forking, yes, it exists. Easier, yes, by probably a magnitude. But we shouldn't be naive that this is just going to be like easy and that like our content is just like fine and it's purely protable and transportable. We should kind of know what we're committing to. And at Folklore, when we're committing to publishing on Mirror, it's because we believe that Mirror is providing us the best user experience and it's going to be with us for the long haul. In the same way that when I chose to deploy the mid-season pass on Zora, it's because I think Zora is great. And I think it's like the user experience that they're providing and the safety that they're providing for the protocol is something that I want my contracts to emulate.
Yeah. Okay. Here's the other question and dynamic that comes to mind, which is I think all of that makes sense. And when we think about the interplay between interfaces and protocols, there is a world in which instead of dealing with all of the like bullshit dynamics that we have unpacked a little bit, you decide, okay, I'm going to build my own vertical for Folklore. I'm going to have custom, contracts and a custom interface. And this is going to be my distribution so that I don't have to rely on anyone. I know it's dependable. What is the reasoning behind not doing something like that?
I mean, honestly, it's just a lot of effort. Can you imagine the amount of like time and technical like expertise that you would need to do this? I mean, maybe GPT-4, the 45, will, potentially solve for this, which it might. But I think that's also, I don't know. I think there's going to be these type of like more luxury media verticals, as Stephanie would say, that have their own like complete vertical and complete control and complete like custom experience. I'm sure there are artists today which are building something similar, and that's totally okay. I personally, when I think of Folklore, I want Folklore to be within the network. I want Folklore to be alive within the different protocols which exist and different interfaces that exist. I actually don't want a monolithic vertical. What I want is a purely, on-chain type of infrastructure that will stand the test of time and will survive for 100 or 200 years.
Yeah. I also get the sense, and I would be curious if this resonates, but like, I think that when you build something like that, and I do think that there's value in building your own vertical distribution in particular, because distribution is such a weird problem that I think like quote unquote centralization and distribution is actually sometimes better. And centralization can just be the centralization of, your assets into one specific protocol. But that aside, I do think that there's something interesting about like not siloing your community in the sense that, if your community, if Folklore wanted to do a drop with Meta Label, and another set of communities, being able to have those assets also be interoperable with whatever you're doing feels really important. And I think when you start to get too verticalized at the protocol level, you do run into some challenges.
It's the inevitable like deviation from standards, right? Like, and I think this is not just like creating a vertical. This is also every protocol that we have today, which is building new feature sets. With every new feature set, you are deviating a tiny bit more from the standard. You might have the standard, but you're also adding additional feature sets on top of it. So over time, the amount of interfaces that fully compose with your protocol, whether it's yours or whichever one you use, there'll be like a deviation. The number of interfaces may decrease, like for full composability, even if they increase because more interfaces are supporting like specific standards. And so this interplay between distribution, functionality, and flexibility, and your own ownership of the content and the contracts that you're using, uh, I think will be an interesting. There's probably a trilemma there somewhere that we can tease out maybe after the podcast.
Yes, or at the end of the summer after you've
or at the end of the summer. Yeah.
After you've gone deep into some of the stuff. Okay, as we wrap up, I'm curious, like as you think about this and as you're doing research on it and really exploring what all of this means, what do you see as interesting or promising alternatives to what we have now, and or how some of this stuff might end up playing out?
Yeah, I think there's three different potential pathways that over the past week have kind of emerged as I have had conversations about this and as my own practical experience in folklore has gone. The first is, during the summer protocols, we had a great lecture with two of the core researchers around the differences between standards and protocols. And we were talking about the fact that standards are declarative statements. And this is kind of what brought me into realizing like the limitations of standards and then the flexibility of protocols in the context of those standards. So I think the first option is to actually expand the standard set. Maybe we should develop a standard for a mint button and for a burn button, right? And for other types of interactions. Obviously, we've barely scratched the surface as to what it means to interact with an NFT. So it's probably too early to commit to specific standards. But having an eye towards actually developing those standards, that's great. The slight downside of that is whichever protocol lobbies the hardest and has the largest voice is probably going to be quite influential in the standard that's decided. And the protocols which do not already follow that standard will have to update. And yes, your contracts, which you might have minted this year, may not be interoperable with many interfaces in the future. Okay, sure. Pros and cons. That's the standard expansion. The second is we could start thinking about micro protocols. So I could start developing a factory that is my own protocol that's always updated to the recent standards. And maybe I create a set of contracts which reference each other so that they always reference the latest standard. So the ownership and the transfer and the supply. And so the ERC 721 is maybe like a very purist type of standard. And then it's kind of like composable with all the other different functions. Not 100% sure how that would work. Not an engineer. I'm sure people will listen to this podcast and say that I said things wrong. Totally possible. But I do think maybe there's some protocol engineering that can take place such that you have guarantees for this type of like interoperability or composability. That's the second one. The third one, which I actually think is very interesting and possible, is this concept of like creator-centric middleware. Maybe when I interact with an interface, that interface actually connects with this middleware that just swaps in and swaps out contracts. And so my audience doesn't even know what protocol they use. We just always use the lowest fee protocol that is composable with the interface. Hilariously, yeah, protocols become commodities. The funniest thing about this, though, is that middleware creator-centric like software tool, that's actually what a platform is. So like,
right.
We're just back to platforms, which is fine. I'm not saying they're good. Centralization is awesome. That's another potential. If you're not choosing the protocol, if the interface is choosing the protocol, and you're just swapping in and out protocols, and you're delegating, that ownership and that decision to the protocol itself, to the interface that you're working with, which is fine.
It's totally almost like a creator union of sorts. Like, I mean, if you imagine a world in which, creators come together and they, of course, in my mind, I'm like, oh, that's going to be a DAO, obviously. And the creators are going to be able to delegate their votes to a little team of people who do the trade-offs. And there's an interesting world in which it actually starts to look more like a creator union, which would have a ton of power over protocols vying for their business. Which is a very,
this is you can ask the question like who actually controls the protocol, like,
Yeah.
and that answer is not that necessarily clear. Like, it might be a multi-sig or it might be a single wallet that has admin rights. I mean, depending on the size of the company and who has those keys, like that's interesting. I can see a future where the protocol users have a specific voice where they can veto information. Right now, it's kind of interesting to ask who is actually in control of the protocol, the fees, the changes to it. And in a lot of cases, we're still in the early days. It's like the core team, right? But that might not be true in the future for all these different like media protocols.
Totally. Yeah. And then, of course, you get into questions around like how much do creators need to know about these protocols to make informed decisions? How do you abstract away some of that, which I think is also going to be a really important part of this stuff. I mean, to be fair, like we've made lots of empty promises to creators, including, hey, we'll enforce your royalties. And then the
We
market,
have, we have
yeah. Yeah.
I look, it's all still shaken out. I think this is one creator's perspective of like what's going on. And yeah, I'm excited to start this conversation. Like, let's talk about content liquidity. Let's talk about like what the power dynamics are between protocols and interfaces and between different protocols which rely on each other. Let's talk about how decisions are made and how fees are structured and whether they should be stacked or discounted and who is the creator paying or is the audience paying or the collector paying. I think these are all the conversations that we will have to have now that consumer crypto is actually a thing. There are creators. We are building on crypto. Let's talk about the things that come next.
Yes. Well, I'm very excited that you're doing this research. Rafa, where can people learn more about you and what you're thinking about and building and also Folklore?
So you can go to folklore.institute and definitely start the journey with us. We're on our way to creating a community AI that supports our curation, our work. If you want to hang out with me, feel free to get in contact with me on Twitter at Rafa the Builder, or just visit my website, raphael.fyi. Thanks so much, Chase.
Love it. Thank you, Rafa.